Hello and welcome everyone to the latest City St George's European Social Survey and NatCen Survey Methods webinar. I'm Tim Hanson, a Senior Research Fellow at the European Social Survey headquarters, and I'll be chairing today's session. And we're very pleased to welcome Tanja Kimova, who is Head of Evidence for the European Union and Multilateral Institutions at Verian, and Gijs van Houten, who is the Senior Manager in the Employment Unit at Eurofound. Tanja and Heath will present on the European Working Conditions Survey, which is one of Europe's largest employment surveys, and specifically about a range of methodological experiments carried out as part of the 8th edition of the survey in 2024. They'll talk for the first part of the hour, and after that, there'll be time for questions. If you do have questions, please type these into the Q&A area, and we'll go through as many as we can. So now I'll hand over to Tanja and Heath to start the presentation.
Thanks very much, Tim, and thanks very much for having us. Yeah, you've already introduced us, so we don't have to introduce ourselves. Tanja might want to say hi.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm really pleased to be here.
Yeah, so we've entitled our presentation "Designing for Comparability in a 3MC Survey," because we're sort of trying to present highlights, I would say, rather than an overview, because that would take longer than an hour of all the work that we've been doing as part of the Working Conditions Survey 2024, and we hope to plant some seeds for discussion later on. So what will we be talking about? No, it's not moving in. No. We first want to talk a little bit about why designing for comparability is so hard, the thinking that has been going on in Eurofound, the thinking that's going on in the field in general, also in Verian. Then we talk more specifically about the design of the European Working Conditions Survey, what we've learned from running two modes in parallel, online and face-to-face. What we've learned from embedded experiments in the survey, which were quite a couple, and then we want to take it back to this bigger discussion about where that puts us in terms of looking at comparability across countries over time, and how that then is reflected in the choice of the most appropriate design. So yeah, why is it so hard? I mean, we don't need to tell you why it's hard. I think most people that are here know that it's hard, and they have some idea why. In Eurofound, we've been given this a lot of thought. Let's first say, if you don't know Eurofound, we're the European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions. So we're a European agency, and we do research and try and bring research findings to policymakers in Brussels. And we run a couple of surveys. We've been running a working condition survey since 1990, quality of life survey since 2003, and a European company survey since 2004. And we've also dipped our toes into non-probability surveys since COVID. We've been running annually a survey that's called the Living and Working in Europe survey. But way before COVID already, we started thinking about whether it would be sustainable to continue to conduct our surveys face to face. And this is a discussion that wasn't just going on in Eurofound. I think this is going on throughout the field already for probably a couple of decades. We've done some work, got expert advice in looking into like what would be the best way to keep it sustainable for us to run the surveys, also given the budget we have, and what decision we would need to take on the survey mode. And we managed to free up a good bit of budget to run the survey in parallel, face to face and online in 2024. And that would then allow us to take decisions for our surveys more generally in terms of what direction we want to take them. And this is, I think, the big question, that our initial thinking was we would want to move the whole survey online. We would prefer to have the survey administered in the same mode across all countries, and that's also how our design for the test in 2024 was informed. And then because our budget wasn't infinite, we had to make some compromises. So we could only do online, not self-administration in a broader sense. So we didn't have an offline option. But we didn't really think about it in a different way, which is something that we sort of want to start a conversation about today. Or it's not the start of a conversation; it's a conversation that's ongoing, but it's something that we want to revisit because we're faced with a situation where, in principle, doing the same mode in different countries doesn't mean that you get the same thing in different countries. There are very different circumstances that we're faced with in each of the countries where we're conducting the survey, and we'll get to that in more detail later on. But we know that people don't respond in the same way to different modes. In some countries, people are more likely to open the door when somebody knocks on the door. In some countries, people are more likely to engage in a face-to-face interview or are more likely to engage in an online survey. So we see differences in contact rates and refusal rates across countries, but we also see differences within the modes within countries. So different people respond differently to different survey invitations, and countries might differ in those differences. So then how do you end up in terms of comparing your results between countries if it's not the same subset of people that respond to your surveys? And some of this you can address by weighting, and some of this you can't. And that's what we're going to talk about in a lot more detail throughout this this presentation. So maybe I can hand it over to Tanja.
Thanks. So this slide is basically a continuation of what you were just discussing, Gijs, and it's meant to really reflect the reality which is on the ground. So we set out to achieve equivalence across countries over time and within countries, and kind of protect the comparability. But what we're facing is, for example, differences in the availability and the quality of the sample frames. The next slide. So maybe we can just flip to the next slide, because this is one that illustrates the first point, and then we can go back and look at the list. So this is just one aspect of the many aspects that we're facing. So we were tasked to cover 35 countries, of which the parallel run was run in 29. This slide is only presenting the EU 27, so excluding Switzerland and Norway, but they can easily be sort of added to the mix. And it's meant to really illustrate with three different kind of aspects of just accessing the sample frames, the heterogeneity that we're facing. So if we just look at the register type, we have 16 countries where we have individual registers, 7 countries where we have address-based registers, and then 4 countries where we have no registers, so where we need to either rely on building registers or on enumeration, so a list that we established when we start fieldwork. And this, obviously, the type of register we have will determine what Gijs, you mentioned earlier around the contact modes, right? So how will we be able to reach out and sample the population? Then there's another set of obstacles, which is around accessing the register. So in some countries, so in 18 countries, they're easy and likely to access with or without institutional support, but obviously very optimistic that we will be able to indeed access. Then there are 5 countries where it's difficult or almost impossible to access the registers. And some of the difficulty, for example, I would name a country like Germany. We have to go to each municipality to access the register. So the average time that it takes to access all of the municipalities and sample is around 5 to 6 months. So it sort of translates into some timeline and some labor-intensive activities. And then there are the countries where we have no register. So then, even if we set out to do a certain design, we may end up with obstacles along the sort of route, because we weren't able to access that register, and then we need to flip to another backup design, a fallback option. And then we have the contact mode viability. So this is we have unreliable, for example, postal services. So this is, even if we have registers in place, the postal services won't do a good job within the country as a whole. And this was something that was advised to us, for example, for Bulgaria or in Ireland, where the postal services, because they don't deliver reliably in rural areas, may impact on sort of coverage. And then we have the ease, obviously, of access of the register. So if we go back to the previous slide, another constraint that I mentioned is the availability and the quality of postal services. Then we have some legal constraints that impact whether we can access the registers, but also the type of communication that will go out to people. So this will determine what is the type of data protection notice that we need to send out. But also, if we want to have a very harmonized design, we may need to go for the lowest common denominator. So that will impact on the type of communication that we can send across the EU27, because we have legal constraints in some countries. It will also impact, for example, the administration on unconditional incentive. Then we have varying digital access in different countries, which will determine, obviously, the coverage. And then we have different sort of literacy levels, and that is related to sort of perceived cognitive burden and the behaviors when people enter the survey, but also the likelihood to sort of engage with self-completion modes. And I think the next slide is yours.
Yeah, and this is the big issue here. So obviously, when we set out to design the working conditions survey, we aim to have a unimode design across all countries, face-to-face as well as online. And doing that exercise made us think more and again about, given the budget that we have, to what extent does what we here labeled here the traditional route to comparability give us the best possible outcome within the restrictions that we're operating under? So we're trying to use input harmonization. We try to use the same mode everywhere, using as similar as possible a design, using as similar as possible procedures. But as Tanja outlined, when trying to apply this, we're faced with a big variety in structural as well as cultural circumstances under which we have to implement that. And the question then becomes, are we doing as good as we can with this this input harmonization paradigm, or would there be scope for doing better if we were to open ourselves up to other possibilities, and what in the end will give us the best comparability? But that's all the big question, and I think we'll now take it back a little bit to the more precise questions of what we did in the Working Conditions Survey 2024. So how we did it, it was the first time we applied the survey online. So the questionnaire was adapted for online administration, which means that we also had a review of the questionnaire and changed it such that it was most suited for online administration. And then we fielded it as a parallel run, and we managed to do that in all of the EU27 member states and Norway and Switzerland. Then, depending on register availability and quality, we applied contacting by email, post, or telephone. In those countries where we applied email contacting, where the register did not hold an email address, we applied postal contacting. And telephone contacting was applied in countries where either there was no register or there was a register, but postal services weren't good enough to implement a postal design. So that in its own right is an interesting exercise, and it's very similar, I guess, to what is happening in the European Social Survey this time round, where you run your old design face-to-face in parallel to a new design, although the new design wasn't perfect, and I alluded to this earlier already. We had to implement the test on like in a restricted budget, and unfortunately, when you need to take decisions in a restricted budget, getting the data that you need for our policy purposes would have gotten priority over getting the test as good as possible. So every once in a while, we had to compromise a little bit on how to implement the new design compared to the old design. And we'll talk again, I think we'll touch upon this later as well, because it has implications of for what we can learn from what we did in the parallel run. Nevertheless, I think the exercise was very, very informative and provided a very rich and comprehensive source of information, and not just for us, but for everybody. So you're all invited to express interest in analyzing our data, but let's first show you what we did with it. Tanja again.
Thanks. So we had an ambitious experimental trial program. We did a robust literature review because we had decided that we would identify what is best practice and what has been established as levers that we can simply activate, and we can do that across all countries, and where we want to maximize the learning. So the idea was to really learn as much as possible from the embedded experimental trial, so we can inform future designs, EWCS, and the rest of the push to web sort of designs. So we then decided to test 3 factors: questionnaire length, not because we don't know enough about questionnaire length, but because it's always also survey specific. So the topic will determine how that interacts with the questionnaire length, and also the type of audience. So a lot of the testing was with general public, and also a lot of the testing has been done in non-European context. So we really wanted to check how questionnaire length works in Europe with this particular sort of group workers, and then with the topic that we're working on. Then within household selection, we simply determined that because of the variety that we have with the registers, there will be a number of countries where we will need to set and go about how we recruit randomly within a household. And there was always the choice of recruiting one person or maximizing, so doing a census, so that was the NE4 design, or selecting 2 respondents, and then we wanted to see what will give us the best sort of data quality and best yield without losing too many households that don't respond because the burden is simply too much, or the instructions are too difficult to follow. And then we tested the incentives. So the incentives, it's worthwhile mentioning that there was a robust test in the pilot, which also included unconditional incentives, which then proved to improve both data quality and response profile, but they weren't cost neutral. So this was one of the compromises that I was alluding to. So then because they weren't cost neutral, we then only proceeded with conditional incentive. We also learned from the pilot that the higher incentive sort of pays for itself. So then we pushed it a little bit more because we wanted to discover the ceiling of what high incentives can actually deliver for us. So then we identified 7 countries where we set a new high. And so we took the previous high from the pilot and named it low. And then we pushed the incentive to another sort of ceiling level to see whether they can bring additional benefits. So these were the tests, and it was obviously designed as a factorial test.
Thank you. So then I'm going to show some top line findings of what happened when we moved the survey face to face. And this is a slide that many of you probably have seen if you've attended any other presentation that I've done on the topic previously. It shows our main stage yield rates. I talk about yield because I've put 2 metrics on the slide. It's the conversion rate. So how many people of the people that we actually contacted, for how many of those people did we receive a valid interview? And then the response rate is the closest approximation I could make to the APOR-RR3 calculation. But because when you're using postal push to web, you have no screener data or nothing. So the only indication we can have of eligibility, which is a big thing in the working condition survey, because we target workers rather than the general population, are reference statistics. So I've discounted those with unknown eligibility by the statistical estimate of eligibility rather than a intrinsic measure. What it shows is that response rates are, for our survey anyway, I would say decent for the postal push to web approach. Like, there's others that would be stricter than I would be, but at least in all of those countries, we managed to get into the double digits, and in some countries well over that level. And it needs to be kept in mind that this is online only. But for RDD-based push to web, it shows that they are dire. We know that telephone response rates are problematic generally, so it's difficult to get good response rates on the telephone. Combine that with the conversion from telephone to online, where you lose again between 50 and 75% of your sample, we end up with below single digit response rates in some countries, which of course is not something that we'd be very pleased by. The next slide shows how that compares to face-to-face. So what I've done is I've deducted the conversion rate, so not the response rate, but the conversion rate for face-to-face from the online one. And that shows that in almost all countries, face-to-face performs better in terms of yield rates. This is not a surprise. What I think is worth noting is that there is one shining example for postal push to web, which is Sweden, where we clearly outperform face-to-face in terms of our yield and response rates. Then there's a handful of countries where the differences are very small: Finland, Luxembourg, Denmark, Belgium, arguably even the Netherlands. The difference between postal push to web and face-to-face in terms of yield rate is not particularly large. And another country that I think is worth mentioning is Germany, because if you remember the previous slide that showed these incredibly poor yield rates for RDD push to web, given that face-to-face only performs about 9 percentage points better, it suggests that with face-to-face in Germany, we also have difficulty achieving double-digit response rates, which of course is not where we want to be at. But again, the picture is face-to-face performs better overall than online, but there's a good bit of variability in countries, and there are some countries where the opposite is true. And in a way, this next couple of slides, which are about sample performance, will show a similar picture. So what it shows in this case is the average difference in blue and the absolute average difference in orange on the right side for a number of reference statistics, where I've compared the results from the European Working Conditions Survey to those from the LFS. And what we basically find is that when it comes to gender and age, online performs equally well, if not maybe slightly better than face-to-face. So we in online managed to do a little bit better in getting younger people in, and we managed to do a little bit better in getting men in. But then when you move to the other variables, and particularly education, and again, this is a known issue, we find that all the flavors of online perform worse than face-to-face. But I think what's also striking is that the difference between RDD-based push-to-web and postal push-to-web with an individual register is larger, much larger than the difference between face-to-face and postal push-to-web. So it really matters how you conduct your online survey. And then we're coming back to this discussion, and we'll touch upon that later. It's like, if you don't have the infrastructure to do it properly, that's where you run into trouble, whereas actually the quality differences might be a lot smaller when you have the appropriate infrastructure to conduct the survey online. Sector is the bottom one where I compare production to services. There we find that face-to-face didn't perform particularly well either. So it's slightly worse for online, but none of them do great. Occupation is very heavily correlated with education. So there we see a similar pattern to education. And then I did something similar that I did with the previous slide, where I try to like zoom in on into the country differences, and here I subtracted the average absolute difference from face to face, or from online, from the average absolute difference for face to face. So again, bars that are above the line are the situation where online performs better, and bars below the line show the situation where face to face performs better. And this slide is remarkably similar to the slide that we showed on yield rate before. So obviously there's a correlation there. It's not perfect. So there's some countries that perform slightly better than others. Again, Sweden stands out as the one country where online clearly performs better than face to face. Again, there's a handful of countries, and to some degree they overlap with the countries as mentioned in terms of yield, where the differences are very, very small. And here there's some interesting countries, Czechia and Slovakia, where actually the differences between RDD push to web and face-to-face are very, very small, even though we have these very poor response rates with regard to RDD push to web. And I guess these are countries where we've been struggling to get face-to-face fieldwork done in the past, and that suggests that in terms of doing it, it also renders a sample profile that's not as good potentially as we might get in other countries. Reversely, they performed reasonably well in terms of the RDD push to web, because we had very high conversion rates. So even though the phone response rate was still low, if people then agree to do it, they go and do it, and that might impact on sample profile. Then when looking at data quality, we've looked at many indicators throughout the survey, and we had an extensive data quality framework in terms of managing and monitoring the survey, but I'm only highlighting a couple of measures. So on the one hand, that's a measure that captures how often the script flags inconsistencies. So where people, in answering a question, give an answer that contradicts, or at least potentially contradicts with an answer they've given previously in the survey. Arguably, this is a quality measure that's sort of stacked against online, because when there's an interviewer there, they would intervene before the script would flag it. So you would expect face-to-face to perform better on this indicator, and that's what's reflected in these results. Then straight lining I've operationalized by counting the number of item batteries where people answer all questions the same. And we find that the differences between online and face-to-face aren't that pronounced, particularly not if you look at postal push to web with an individual register. And for the households, we do find a bigger difference, and there it needs to be kept in mind that, as Tanja showed in the design, that we allowed for multiple respondents in the household, and the selection of those respondents was left up to the households themselves. So arguably, incentives might be a bigger driver of participation in the survey, which would then explain sort of a higher degree of satisfying behavior. Pattern is somewhat similar with regard to item non-response, where generally online non-response is somewhat higher than in face-to-face, and worse for postal push to web, where a household approach was applied. And then I've created again a similar slide to the previous ones. It's a bit, yeah, I'm not sure about the aesthetics of this one. It's a bit harder to read because I've put the two bars in it, so it shows the both the highest or the worst percentile and the worst decile, and I can only sort by one. So the blue bars are a bit easier to follow maybe than the orange ones. I would say the biggest message here is that we find a different pattern than we found for yield and performance. So data quality is affected differently by mode than yield and performance. And also we find a different pattern depending on whether we look at the worst percentile and the worst decile. And this becomes a bit of a measurement question, like not sure whether the worst decile in the distribution is that bad, right? The worst percentile are the people that are really at the bottom in terms of the three indicators that I've just discussed. And the distributions are quite tight. So these are the cases that stand out in terms of poor quality. When you move into the decile, the quality difference maybe isn't that pronounced anymore. So that's why I also sorted by the blue bars. And in the end, the message is there's differences. They're not that large for some countries, but generally online performs worse. And that's also what we saw in the previous slide. And again, Slovakia and Czechia stand out for somewhat better quality data online compared to the other countries. Another analysis that we did was on mode effects, and this is a tricky one. And at the moment, we've actually focused a lot on variables that are of clear interest to us from a substantive point of view for reporting. And we haven't necessarily done it from a methodological point of view. So the type of variables that were selected to look at are very much to do with the circumstances in which people conduct their work. But that means that they might verge more towards arguably compositional effects than measurement effects. So we do find striking mode effects. These are large effects where people that have responded to the online survey are 3 times as likely to report to have more than a single job. They're much more likely to report being paid with a piece rate. They're much more likely to report working from home. They're much more likely to work in flexible hours. They're more likely to report that technology has created more tasks for them, and more likely to report that a computer program determines their work. All of this sort of suggests, and it's basically the obvious, that if you do an online survey, it's more likely to be responded to by people that, as part of their occupation or as part of the job that they do and the tasks that they carry out as part of their job, find themselves behind a desk and behind a computer. And what we don't know and what we cannot tease out as well, haven't been able to tease out as well yet, is to what extent they actually answer the question differently because it's presented to them in a different way, or whether it's just because it's different people that respond to the survey. That said, if we wait for the usual suspects, so age, sex, education, and occupation, that doesn't really mitigate these differences. So most of these claims still hold even when you, or all of them still hold even when you correct for weighting. So we find that the differences reduce a little bit, but not to the extent that you wouldn't still make these remarks. So there might be scope for more sophisticated weighting. There's definitely scope for sort of do some more decomposition analysis. But to actually correct for it will be difficult because there won't be any reference data for this type of information. And I think what's also interesting, and when Tanja and I were discussing the presentation, it's also something that we landed upon is this is a working condition survey, right? So now we look at this type of thing, but when you're doing online surveys in the general population, you're quite likely to have these type of differences as well. But you don't even have the observational data to show that you're generating these patterns in your online sample. So to now, this was a top line result of basically the parallel run in its own right, and showing differences between face-to-face and then online, and then the variability within online in terms of the designs. And Tanja will talk now a little bit more about the actual experiments that we've embedded in the survey design.
Brilliant. So indeed, we had a very rich program, as I mentioned earlier, and we set out to answer some 16 research questions, which were themed around response and recruitment. So does questionnaire length, incentive level, contact strategy, and their interaction affect who responds? Does it vary across countries and population or subgroups? Completion and break-off. Obviously, many institutions have a long time series which they would like to preserve. So it's of interest to understand whether length determines the rate of completion and whether length determines sort of break-off patterns. And then data quality is another very important theme. So can we improve data quality by higher incentive levels? Does mode affect the engagement? It went to a previous slide. Thank you. So can we say something about response differentiation, etc.? Then the mode effects, I think Gijs talked about. So between online and face-to-face, does it indeed produce substantively different results, and does that vary across response profiles? And then cost efficiency is obviously another one, because budgets are never infinite, even if they're large. So what combination of design choices can we lever to optimize the trade-offs that we inevitably need to make between cost bias and data quality? So we would need a lot of time to present all of the learnings. This was a very large paper of a few hundred pages that we then co-wrote together with the University of Michigan. So here we're just gonna present some sort of summary, and it will be themed around break-off rates, the incentive level, and then the effect of the length of the questionnaire. So I'll just start with the length of the questionnaire. This is really just meant to give you a flavor of what we embedded. So the full questionnaire started with the survey pitch, where we outlined clearly what would be the length. And then there was sort of a thank you in the end, and in between there was just the full questionnaire. And then we had the M1, M2. So this was the alternative. So this is on the next slide. So this is the internal jargon. So what we did basically is we identified some key number of metrics that were essential. So if the EWCS is going to continue in a shortened version, these would be the metrics that we would like to keep, ideally in a time series. So this constituted the M1 module. So this was presented as the short. So it's not a modular design in sort of the classical sense, but we really what we did is we took the full questionnaire and then we split it into two modules, of which one was foundational and essential, and the second one was aspirational. And if we could get and maximize the data points in the second module, that would be simply a terrific outcome. So what we did is when we pitched the survey, we used the same exact pitch in terms of purpose, but then we only went with the M1 length, which was 20 to 25 minutes. And then the respondent was simply presented with these questions. So obviously they didn't, because it was a subset of questions, we then reordered. So they experienced also a different order of questions. We then thanked them for their participation, and we asked them, we also offered the incentive that was promised to them at the beginning of the survey. And then we offered to complete a second module, which is voluntary, and they could do that right away, or they could do time. And there was a contact strategy that was sort of followed by reminders. So then the module 2 was presented, and then in the end there was a thank you. In both versions, the full and the M1, M2, at the end, people were invited to also take part in the Eurofound panel. So then so this is just really a visual representation of what I've been saying. So there was a recruitment module which varied across countries because of the heterogeneity of the registers. We were contacting people via postal push-to-web approach, so via letters or via phone. There was eligibility being determined either via instructions in the letter or via a screener that was administered over the phone. And then people would then decide to take the survey, and at that point in time, they were randomly assigned to the main survey or to the main survey, which would be either the long questionnaire or the M1, M2 module. So then if we go to the next slide, this is summarizing the analysis of the break-off rates. So what we basically are concluding, the first thing is that respondents assigned to the short version were significantly more likely to reach the end of the M1 module, confirming that the shorter questionnaire succeeded in securing the key EWCS metrics from more respondents. So 16%, the break-off rate was 16% compared to the 21% for the full. So, and that was a statistically significant difference that held across countries. Then the main vulnerability of this modular M1, M2 design was that at the point in time when people were asked to complete the second module, one additional segment broke. So this represents the 27% of the break-off 2 at that point in time. And then 67% did not complete the M3 module, meaning that even if they said they would, many did not go through with it, or they didn't come back to the survey in case they had the intention to do it and then come back to it later, but eventually did not. So in the end, overall, when we look at the full data points that we set out to collect via the full questionnaire, indeed, the full questionnaire was more successful at doing this overall, because many respondents actually did not complete the M2 module. Then if we look at the pattern of break-off rate, so this is what first we look at the analysis of the break-off across subgroups of respondents. So most of the sociodemographic questions were asked at the end, and because they're absent for a lot of the respondents that broke off, we only concentrated on the ones that we had. So this was urbanity and age, and there was a very clear pattern where respondents in urban areas and older respondents are more likely to break off, while incentive level had very little effect on the break-off rates. So then if we look at so the question order and the content of the question that drives the break-off, there was something very interesting emerging. So over a third of the break-offs occurred in the first 22 points in both the full and the short, so the M1 module. And they were concentrated really at the start. And Q4 was the first open-ended question that asked about the job description. So this is where we saw the first drop-off peak. Then it went to the second drop-off peak, which was Q5. So this was second open-ended question, and then there was some break-offs, as you can see from the orange and the green chart. What was striking was that 9 out of 10 of the dropout questions where we saw the highest peaks were the same across both the full and the M1 module. So we were curious what would happen if we sort of reorder and we sort of make this fake scenario where we reorder the M1, M2 to match the full questionnaire. Would people sort of break off following the same pattern? And actually, if you see, the graphs now almost are fully identical. So what we're concluding is that the respondents drop out on average only slightly earlier in the full questionnaire, so 99 versus 103. But the questions at which they drop off are the same, yeah, the charts almost match identically. So then, if we go to the next thing that we analyzed, so we looked at incentive amount and the effect that that has on yield rate and cost effectiveness. So just to define how we calculated yield. For the postal push to web, because we had different registers, the denominator varied. So it was always the address and not the number of persons that responded. So then the yield would be obviously higher where we have address frames. For the telephone, we decided to take the number of people that engaged with the telephone interview, because otherwise the gross sample would have been simply too big. So then we only took the people that accepted the telephone interview and initiated the telephone screener. And then if we look at the results, we can see that the higher incentive substantially reduce cost per complete, and they generate, so they always sort of pay for themselves because they systematically generate higher yield regardless of the type of register or across countries. What we also saw was that the short questionnaire in the end ended up being more expensive. Even if the yield was higher, that was not enough to compensate for the fact that there was a significant drop in the total data points that we were collecting. So we ended up with the conclusion that the short questionnaire is more expensive per item because simply fewer questions were collected for each respondent. And then we looked at the impact of incentive on survey duration on engagement and data quality, because one aspect of incentives and survey duration is the impact it has on compositional differences, which is the previous slide. But then once people are in the survey, does it affect? So if we give them a shorter survey, or if we give them more money, will we see improvement in data quality or not? So then we took, I think I mentioned this, there was a very robust framework in terms of all of the metrics that comprise data quality. So this is now a reduced framework looking at 3 themes of survey engagement that was measured across 3 variables. So interview duration, the proportion of item non-response, so don't know responses, and an even interview pacing, response differentiation, which was measured in a few different ways. So the proportion of consecutively identical responses, the longest string of identical responses, and the Mulligan score, and then the quality of the verbatim, so the open-ended answers. And then all of that was put together in a data quality index, and the results are on the next slide. So what we're basically seeing is that incentives and questionnaire length do not affect data quality in any significant way. So it doesn't really affect how long respondents took to complete the survey. It doesn't affect on the pacing of their responses. They're not speeding up at the end if they get more money, or if they're exposed to a short or full length. Straight lining and response differentiation is not significantly affected. The quality of verbatim, which was measured via word count, and sector dispersion are not affected. And then it doesn't really affect the composite data quality index that we were able to measure. There were only 2 minor exceptions. So higher incentive modestly reduced item non-response only in the full questionnaire, but I am flagging that the effect was really modest. And there was a marginally significant interaction between incentive and questionnaire length for one open-ended question, but it was too weak to interpret as a reliable, and certainly it wasn't a consistent effect. So in fact, the bottom line is that incentive and questionnaire length are levers for yield and cost. They also impact, but they do not impact sample composition. However, they're not levers for data quality. So paying more or asking less does get you more respondents. It just doesn't make their data or engagement better.
Yeah, so then we're back at like, what does this now tell us in terms of where we stand on comparability and design choice? And I think the tricky bit is, like, we found many things, or not many, but we found several things that we can do to improve not so much the quality, but at least the performance of online in terms of yield and sample composition. I imagine there's still quite a lot of scope in terms of improving the quality of the online responses. I think there's still a lot of work that can be done in terms of improving instrument design and to get that better. But what we also did show is that there's a good bit of variability, that generally the quality of the online responses is worse, and that there's a lot of country variability that seems to be somewhat associated, at least with the circumstances in which you do the survey. So, like, yeah, we find yields are lower, representative is lower, and there's high rates of item non-response and straight lining, but not everywhere. That still makes us think about, like, what can we do, right? Like, we also found mode effects, I think, and we sort of qualified that already. We can do some more work in terms of disentangling the measurement effects from the composition effects. And arguably those composition effects can't be fully fixed, but again, and this is something that we haven't looked at in detail, these will also vary across countries. So we're still left with the question, in the end, is it better or worse for your comparability to do online in a country where online performs badly than to do face-to-face in a country where online performs badly? And you know that you will get mode effects by doing face-to-face there, but if that's the mode that is favored and gets you the best yield and gets you the best sample performance, then the question remains, like, how much worse is that then? The point that we're trying to make is that we should try and quantify these differences and be more precise about it, rather than to assume that the known effects that we get from varying modes are putting it the wrong way. We have known effects and we have unknown effects, and we verge towards avoiding mode effects, measurements effects due to mode, but that comes at the expense of effects that we think that are known, but might actually be very large. And maybe these very large known effects are larger than the unknown effects that we're trying to avoid. So that's, I think, the challenge here. So arguably there's two ways of going about things, and neither of them are clean. And this is where we're back to this clean designs, dirty hands point that we raised earlier. So we can try and apply the same design everywhere to the extent that we manage to get that done. But when this design doesn't match the context, then we're gonna generate differences, and not all of those differences we can correct for. I think there's big questions, and particularly in light of our survey future-proofing efforts, it really makes us wonder, like, if we push in this direction and we say we're going to take all these countries in the same direction, is that then the direction that will continue to hold throughout the future? Do we expect that registers will improve? Do we expect that online participation will improve? And for some of them, I think the answer is yes, and for others, it's less certain. The other option, and it might be more of a short-term thing, but maybe it's it's definitely something that we need to consider given the budgets that we work with, is more of a pragmatic approach, where you say, given that certain designs fit the country circumstances better, maybe that's the best way to do it, and then incrementally improve. But either, like, again, that has the downside that then you don't provide that much of an incentive for countries to switch, and you might never end up in your harmonized ideal world situation. So this is a predicament that we're constantly faced with, and I think we'd be very happy to exchange on with you guys as well. Tanja, maybe you want to add something?
Yeah. So I think it's as you say, it's we are constantly sort of making these trade-offs. I think making these trade-offs on a conscious level is sort of important, because if we end up in sort of the unimode paradigm, we are certainly trading something off, and if we go with a sort of a mixed mode design, then we're trading something else off. And then it's really important to name the trade-offs that are being done, rather than assume that one design is sort of better than another. So I would say a managed sort of documented difference is what is important, and then that sort of takes us a step further in understanding and then being able to apply mitigation for whatever scenario we choose, simply because it's on the table and we're looking at it from all angles. Then there are some things that we could improve with innovation. We are in a world that is fast-paced, where there are technological improvements daily. So there are some promising and partially tested solutions, some that are conceptually sound and not yet operational to roll out at scale, and some that are blue sky thinking. So for example, something that is promising is AI-assisted coding of open-ended responses. So we know that, if we would like to have a harmonized sort of push to web, mostly online or online first design, then we need to tackle breakoffs. And for example, for a European working conditions survey, we tested pre-coded lists, they don't work. So we need to rely on open-ended questions. So how can we then both minimize the breakoff and improve the codability and data quality? One potential solution for that could be AI-assisted coding. We could think about adapted instrument designs. So this kind of real-time routing, a sort of a natural conversation of AI-assisted bots, where they would ask all the questions in a standardized way, but adapt to the respondents, so the interviewing process is more natural. Or reducing the length while still maximizing the analytical depth by sophisticated imputation, using a modular design questionnaire. Then another thing, but that also needs some learning and data points and previous surveys, is a model-assisted contact and recruitment design using predicted response propensity. So a design that would maximize the final sample composition and minimize the cost, because we would know where we need to send a paper questionnaire and where we don't need that, and kind of varying the contact mode either via email first or email then followed up by a push to web, and so on and so forth. And then this idea about third-party data integration. So really start from a design where we strip out what we don't need to collect, because we can easily integrate that from third-party data sources, and then only modularize the questionnaire around the new input that we need to collect. And then some blue sky thinking: what if there are drones or kind of a technology that is not yet available or rolled out that can help us build new sample frames? So it would sort of bridge the problem of not being able to access registers, or register not being available at a country level. So basically allowing us a new way to sample, recruit, and get in touch with respondents. So really the honest position here is that technology can sharpen specific tools. It will, at this point, not resolve the structural heterogeneity that we're seeing in Europe, and that sort of remains a design problem, which is sort of taking us to the question that is sort of in the story arc of this presentation. And then to finish off, so there are obviously the big questions, and then there are things that we slowly build up as our common understanding and knowledge. And this is really that. So what did we learn from the EWCS 2024? Well, we learned a lot of things. We learned that the use of postal push to web over telephone, should be applied wherever the frame and infrastructure allows. Where we don't have a frame and we relied on phone, it's worth considering alternative design, simply because of the very, very, very low response and then attrition that this design would bring. Then we learned that conditional incentives pay for themselves. So it's worth exploring what is the ceiling, but also it's worth investing in higher conditional incentive, because they clearly improve the yield and the response profile across the board and across all countries. We saw that The design needs to account for break-offs at content level, not just at length level. So we need to make sure that we think about the questions and explore the literature and really cognitive test and pilot where these break-offs happen and really try to solve that at design level. Build embedded experiments wherever we can, because they tell us more, and we can sort of add to our library of best practice and knowledge. You know, to Gijs' point about potentially disentangling measurement effect or other learnings that we can lever for future surveys, and then simply enhance our reporting and really report the design choices and the trade-offs that we're making transparently and explicitly, so that we can have an informed debate about what works and what doesn't, and where the trade-offs are happening.